Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todos. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Hoy me complace mucho tener a Sue Stephenson con nosotros para una entrevista en el marco de Conectando Voluntades. Bienvenidos a este espacio, un esfuerzo realizado entre el PNUD, empresas que inspiran, voluntarios de las Naciones Unidas, Ikigai Laboratorio Social Voluntario y el Consejo Latinoamericano de Voluntariado Empresarial Clave, con el objetivo de resaltar los alcances y el potencial que el voluntariado tiene para el desarrollo de las habilidades en personas y en comunidades. Como les dije, hoy estaremos compartiendo una muy interesante entrevista con Sue Stephenson, cofundadora de Impact 2030, una colaboración liderada por el sector privado con las Naciones Unidas, en donde también participan el sector público, social y la academia, con la misión de movilizar inversiones en capital humano a través del voluntariado corporativo para promover los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible. Para empezar, les voy a contar un poquito sobre Sue. Sue ha liderado programas de impacto social desde diferentes roles. Por más de 15 años fue ejecutiva senior en The Ritz-Carlton, expandiendo la filosofía de la compañía Servir con Propósito. Mientras dirigía la División Global de Recursos Humanos, proporcionó dirección estratégica para fortalecer el compromiso de la empresa con sus empleados y fortaleciendo las acciones de servicio de la empresa. En su puesto posterior, Sue también se encargó de desarrollar e integrar estrategias de ciudadanía corporativa en la cultura de servicio, las operaciones comerciales y las métricas de éxito de la empresa. En 2016 fundó Strategies for Service, una consultora que ayuda a las empresas a desarrollar enfoques estratégicos para impulsar el compromiso, el propósito y la pasión de los empleados. Thank you very much, Sue, for sharing this time with us, and welcome.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm delighted. These are obviously unprecedented times, and excited to be engaged in this conversation. Would you like me to give you a little bit of background on Impact 2030?
Sure, let's start with that. Can you tell us a little bit about what Impact 2030 is and why did it start?
Excellent. So Impact 2030 was founded in 2015. Gosh, that seems so long ago, just 5 short years ago, at the time that the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by all 192 member states, countries within the United Nations. There had been dialogue at the United Nations and with the UN Office for Partnerships on the role that the private sector plays and can play in advancing these goals through corporate volunteering, employee volunteering, or human capital investments, however, whichever term is used. At the time, I was with the Ritz-Carlton, and with a number of other companies, we founded Impact 2030. So I'm very proud to be one of the co-founders, and we have spent the last 5 years as an organization. I sit on the executive committee of the board, as well as being a co-founder. And our focus has been how we showcase what companies are doing, but also how do we drive collective action? How do we drive collaboration so that we can scale impact? So it wasn't intended to be an opportunity to rebrand or package employee volunteering with an SDGs banner around it, but really to scale impact. We're very fortunate to have our CEO, who joined us in January, Dr. Ala Murabit, is one of the United Nations SDG advocates and also UN High Commissioner for Health, Economic Growth and Employment. I'll talk a little bit about Ala during the interview, but certainly she brings an incredible perspective, particularly as we've layered on the pandemic and the impacts and the role that corporate volunteering can play. So that sort of fast forwards to 2020.
Incredible what has happened in all of these 5 years. Thank you for that introduction, Sue. And let's dive in with the questions. I mean, And it's impossible to start a conversation about corporate volunteering right now without considering the current global context, and particularly the impacts of COVID-19. So considering that, what do you think is the role that corporate volunteering should play in times of crisis?
It's an excellent question. I think for everybody on the call that they would agree these are unprecedented times. Who would have thought just 4 or 5 months ago that we would be faced with a global pandemic of this sheer magnitude? And I think we are seeing companies start to evolve, start to pivot their employee volunteer programs to help address the needs, the inequities that have been identified. I think for us at Impact 2030, what we are, what we see very clearly is clearly this isn't just a health crisis. I mean, it is a health crisis, but it goes beyond being a health crisis. It really is identifying the inequities that are there and embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals, but it's put a far greater spotlight. So, we've got circumstances around the world where citizens, don't have access to the critical healthcare that they need due to the impacts of COVID-19. We're seeing the economic and social impact, the loss of jobs, the impact of working from home, the impact on schooling children, the far-reaching impacts that in the main people were just not prepared to adapt to. We're seeing the issues of gender inequality, very sadly, the great progress that have been made in the area of gender has been impacted because the statistics are already showing that women have had a greater impact, both economically and social impact because of the pandemic. There's greater instances of domestic violence, which is growing. So all of these things that are happening are layering on issues that we were already aware of. And then in the area of race, over the past few months, we've seen this global movement around racial inequality that has gone far beyond the United States, but around the world. So what does that mean for companies? Because they're seeing these issues that are embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals, but causing incredible hurt, incredible impact on the communities where they live and work and where their employees live and work. So we are seeing this pivot, and I think that companies recognize that this isn't just about the answer to the pandemic is not just identifying a vaccine, because of all of the issues that have manifested themselves as a result of COVID-19. What does that mean for their corporate responsibility focus areas? What does that mean for the focus areas of their employees, who bring their purpose to work with them and want to have the opportunity to play a role in impacting society's needs? So we are seeing companies start some in fact have radically evolved their focus areas, where we're seeing some of our partner companies, and we have, many of the multinationals are part of our portfolio, have definitely evolved over recent months where they're focusing their areas. And then obviously the impact on in-person volunteering, which is, of course, an incredible challenge. It's very, very difficult for employees to be placed into areas where they're potentially put at risk because they're put into, potentially sort of face-to-face issue areas. So an incredible time, but with that brings an incredible opportunity for companies and for their employees to really strategically help address these chronic issues that have manifested themselves.
Yeah, so I think it's very interesting what you were saying about, everything that is happening. A lot of people would like to call the pandemic a great equalizer, when in fact, what it has been is really an amplifier of inequalities. And that's exactly what the SDGs have been trying to do as a frame for understanding the current needs and the current situations that the world is experiencing. I find it very interesting that you mentioned that this pivot, this situation is helping organizations and particularly companies pivot the way that they work, but not because not only because of the pandemic, but also because they understand that their strategy and the way that they operate impacts their context. So in that sense, I would like to ask you, you were explaining a little bit about Impact 2030 and how the organization promotes the power of the private sector and especially its people to advance the achievement of the SDGs, the sustainable development goals. Why do you think this connection is important, and how can corporate volunteer programs help advance the goals concretely?
It's a great question. For us at Impact 2030, it was the recognition that the goals created this roadmap for companies. So certainly there were incredibly robust employee volunteer programs before 2015. Companies were doing great work in the communities where they live and work. But the Sustainable Development Goals created an opportunity to have a common framework and a common language regardless of wherever a company operates, because the goals are applicable to every community around the world. So it was a unique opportunity in time for companies to be able to speak to each other, leveraging the goals as that connection point. Because companies would often have their employee volunteer programs and their broader corporate responsibility initiatives were often, developed on sort of historic focus areas for the company. So this gave an opportunity for companies to start to rethink and again, just talk. I mean, the 17 goals, at a high level, you could say it's 17 beautiful icons, 17 beautiful, maybe not the right word, although I do think the icons themselves are very compelling the way they're drawn. But the power of the Sustainable Development Goals is the interconnectivity that lies with all of them. So if there was a company that was focused on engaging their employees in programs to reduce hunger and poverty in a community, you could see the connection to companies that are focused on education, because obviously you can't educate a child that's hungry. So we've been working with companies to one, create this greater alignment, but also look for these opportunities where they can collaborate together, using the term collective action, so that impact can be scaled. So it's not companies, hundreds of thousands of companies, all on their parallel track, working in silos, but how do we really connect the dots so that communities can benefit? So that's been our that has been our focus area. And then again, we're very fortunate with Ala Murabit coming on board, just with her, as one of the Sustainable Development Goal advocates, and having, appointed by the Secretary General and having a platform at the UN, she can really help us elevate the work that we're trying to do to show the sheer power of the private sector's people, all of that passion, that talent, that creativity that is able to mobilize to impact local communities.
Definitely, and I like how you frame it, explaining the SDGs as a roadmap, because it is indeed that. It serves as a framework for everyone to, not only in the private sector, but within other sectors, to have a conversation. And clearly within the private sector, it has been a very useful tool to talk about things as important as, and I would like to ask you this question before I move on to another subject, but and I know Impact 2030 has done a lot of work around measuring. And at the beginning, when the discussion around the SDG started with corporations, there was a lot of attention from the sector because of a possible way to use them as a framework to measure. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and maybe what are the efforts that Impact 2030 has done in order to have a more robust discussion around measurement of volunteering?
Yes, thank you. So this has been one of our focus areas, because we know that many companies, that the only way in many cases to measure is the number of hours. So, you know, it could be that an employee is engaged on a project where it's a skills-based project and they're sharing skills and expertise to help a nonprofit advance their mission. Or it could be employees are engaged in building homes or working at food banks or educating children. There's no connectivity by just sharing the number of hours that were contributed. Measuring impact is a challenge because the company doesn't determine the impact. It's a nonprofit organization. It's very difficult to be able to realistically identify outcomes and impact of one employee's volunteer actions. It's like, we use the term, the analogy of it, it's like a push-up. You know, what impact does one push-up have, or what impact does walking 1 mile have? You can't measure that. If you're talking about hundreds of push-ups, or you're talking about, you know, running a marathon, you're talking, you know, the magnitude of what you're talking about enables you to connect to showing greater impact. So so if you think of a nonprofit, they have their mission, they have the impact that they want to create, the outcomes and impact that they want to create. So our goal was, how do we determine what a specific company's employee volunteering contributions, how you attribute what they've contributed to the overall impact. So what can they claim is that we played a role in X outcome or X impact. So with that in mind, we have been working on developing a framework. We worked with our partners. I'll be very happy to, we're on a journey at the moment, but so I'm speaking at a very high level, but by the end of the year, we will have a framework to share externally, open source. But we worked with 6 of our partner companies and a consultancy company to create this initial framework. We worked with them, Dow, GSK, PIMCO, a number of other partner companies, and we ran their global employee volunteer data through the framework. It's very, very promising. We're now in phase 2 of testing it. We have had global input into it, and I'm probably not explaining it very well, but we will have this, what we believe is a very easy to operate framework for program managers to use. And we'll make sure, as I say, it's available open source. It's not in tech. Any company, any consulting company can use it. And we will be launching that in December. But the ultimate goal is that we can get it embedded into globally recognized reporting protocols. Because ultimately, if we think about the amount of funding that companies put into their corporate social responsibility departments, into running employee volunteer programs, it's critical, and I'm sure everyone on the call will agree, we have to be able to show the true impact beyond hours in order for it to be a serious business priority. If a company is going to put funding into an initiative, they want to be able to see the results. So it's a serious commitment for us. I look forward to, you know, bringing you all on the journey and to the tool being available for people to use by the end of the year.
Fantastic. No, I know a lot of people are excited about that possibility of having a tool like the one that you're explaining, and we look forward to receiving it as well. And I also want to highlight how, you know, what you were saying, you know, it's very difficult to have a robust case about the impact of volunteering if we don't have a concrete way to measure it. And it needs to go beyond the numbers, and it needs to go beyond the stories, because that in itself, it's not enough. So it's really interesting to see efforts being developed around that important need. So I understanding all of these that you've been explaining, at the beginning you were mentioning a lot of the companies pivoting their strategies and trying to understand how to use different tools. I would like to ask you, how do you think corporate programs are innovating and adapting to respond to the most pressing community needs? And are there certain trends that we should be aware of and exploring a little bit deeper when it comes to that adaptation?
Good question. I think in the early days of COVID-19, we were, as always, companies and their employees are so resourceful and creative and want to serve their communities. Obviously, when it became apparent that in-person volunteering was problematic, we have many of our global partners that have global days of service that fell right in the middle of this period, that suddenly had to decide, what could they possibly do, because all of the plans for the last year weren't going to happen, or even regular ongoing cadence of employee volunteer programs were totally disrupted. There were certainly tremendous examples of, a number have come to mind, but employees that would, recognizing that there is great isolation that came with the, for example, with the pandemic, people isolated at home, seniors isolated at home, there were opportunities to leverage technology to reach out, to make those connections. So many stories out there of, excellent, I think, sort of addressing the immediacy of the situation. But the thing that I have to say that has excited me most is the opportunity to explore virtual skills-based volunteering. And I think beyond the pandemic, we found a lot of companies a lot of our partner companies contacted us to say, help, we have a global day of service coming up, we want to explore virtual volunteering. And there's already a lot of work happening in virtual volunteering world. There are what are called aggregator sites, but there's websites out there that employees can go to and find virtual projects that they could maybe, it might be translating a document, it might be writing a press release, it might be helping design a website, whatever. The challenge with those sites is often there are technology firewalls that don't enable companies to share those sites with their employees. And then the other challenge is it's often that companies partner nonprofits in the communities are often not represented on those sites. So the sites do great work, but they were challenging for companies to adopt. And then on the other side, you've got intermediary organizations that will develop and manage and measure the impact of virtual skills-based volunteering, and that they're doing a tremendous job. We identified, though, that there is a white space in between where companies have all this tremendous talent that is there. How do they connect it with the needs of their nonprofit partners? We've seen nonprofits, NGOs, seriously impacted by both the financial impact of the pandemic, by the loss of in-person volunteering, because often that in-person volunteering fulfills a lot of their needs for work to be done. So we know that those organizations are hurting. But what more than anything, it identified that if we're going to help nonprofit organizations become resilient and to really sustain and be able to make the adaptations that are needed when there's a crisis situation, there's an opportunity to leverage the skills, talent, passion, creativity of the private sector's people. If we think of all of the companies that are on this call, if they think of that immense brain power within an organization, how could that help nonprofits? So one of the things that we have done, we've actually identified an initiative called E-Impact, we've called it. We have to have impact in the name because that's just the nature of our organization. But we held a design lab which was facilitated by PwC. And we had 10 of our partner companies, our founding partner companies, and then stakeholders like UNV. We did this design lab and this was just the very early start. Clearly, there's a lot of work to be done, but to try and identify what are the current roadblocks to effective skills-based volunteering. And we identified, I would say that there's a couple of areas. Companies find it very difficult to identify what the needs are of the nonprofits. The nonprofits find it difficult to strategically determine what help they could get, whether it's strategy and development, human resources, finance and accounting, whatever it might be. So we've identified there's a real need to work with nonprofits to identify how we can make it easy for them to develop what type of skills and talent they need access to, how you connect companies with their nonprofit partners, so what sort of database would be needed so that companies are working directly with their partners. It's not a larger group of these are the projects and companies can look at them, but how can we have a sort of closed loop between companies and their partners? And then thirdly, how do we look at storytelling, quantitative storytelling, to really showcase the power of volunteering, the role of skills-based virtual volunteering can play. So we're on a journey, we're committed to this, but we believe there is this white space that can greatly help advance the SDGs through leveraging the skills, talent, and expertise. And we think it's a journey. We think it's an opportunity for companies to consider skills-based volunteering, virtual volunteering, in tandem with in-person volunteering whenever we get back to normal, if that will ever be, but to really embed this, because I think we all recognize that if an employee has an opportunity to share their expertise, their talent, something of themselves, there is a heightened level of engagement. And also, as part of that, we're also looking at virtual global pro bono. So we're working with USAID on this in particular. They have funded an initiative for us. But whereas in the past, we had a project where companies would send their people into Kenya, into sub-Saharan Africa. That can't happen now. Companies are not going to send their people anytime soon into those assignments. So how can we develop programs virtually where you bring teams together from different companies to work together virtually to service a nonprofit, a community organization? In Kenya will be our first one. But how is that an opportunity to bring added value to international development? So it's not always about putting people on the ground in a location, but can you have people in New York or Barcelona or wherever, Colombia, wherever they might be, to contribute with colleagues elsewhere? So we're calling this professional development with purpose, but really not having to commit to a 3-week assignment, but instead you commit to a 12-week assignment, a couple of hours a week, and you really can revolutionize how an organization is operating. So they're just a number of the things that we're seeing. Sorry, I think I talked too much there. I just get excited about these opportunities.
I think it's very interesting how there are many opportunities arising from the challenges. And I think I like to think about what we're living right now as a world with more restrictions, but less barriers. Because with everything that is happening, we've learned that collaboration can happen in many ways and within sectors. And it doesn't need as much bureaucracy as we think it does, because when the emergency comes and you have the tools, there are many ways to implement and to actually provide help to those who need action concretely and fast. I like what you mentioned about the in-between. I think there's innovation happens in that in-between, and we're going to see a lot of things sparking from what's happening. And I think this connects perfectly with the next question we had prepared, and it's, we've been talking about the power of collaboration. And in that sense, Impact 2030, efforts like the Global Corporate Council in IAVE's Global Corporate Council, also Voluntariado in España, Clave in Latin America, they're all are born out of understanding the power of collaboration. So I would like to ask you, what is your perspective on partnerships and collaborations, and how are they relevant to advance tangible social impact? And how do you think we can define a successful partnerships? Because we also talk a lot about partnerships, but what does it really make a partnership a good effort?
Yeah, that's a great question. At Impact 2030, our belief statement is that, if companies collaborate to bring together the skills, talent, and experience of their employees, they can change the world. And we really believe that it's the only way to scale that impact. I've also believed for a long time that employee volunteering is probably the safest space for companies to collaborate. If you think about companies across different sectors, companies within the same sectors, they can come to the table together without being worried about all the restraints that are there within the business because of competition, because of, whatever it might be. It's such a safe space, but it takes a lot of work, because if it was easy, it would already be happening very easily. And I think in my long career, collaboration is a word that has come up so often. But I think it's also very easy just to, do it within your company and do it with your employees, and you just mobilize. It's less painful because collaboration can be challenging, because you're dealing with companies and organizations have different cultures, different thought processes, different budgets, different focus areas. So, how do you meld all of that together? So one of the approaches that we've taken is through what we've called our regional impact councils, what we're evolving the name to impact hubs, because we believe that collaboration can be most powerful at a local level. Certainly you can have companies collaborate. We have many of the pharmaceutical companies that are part of Impact 2030. So certainly Pfizer and, Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson and Medtronic and GSK, they can certainly collaborate powerfully at a corporate level. But it's also around what happens at that local level, because the needs of each community is slightly different and most pressing. And employees in the main want to be engaged in things that are impacting are most pressing for their community. So we've found these concepts of impact councils where they'll come together around a unifying SDG. So for example, in Toronto, it was SDG 8, so decent work and economic growth. That doesn't mean that a company has to change direction, because we've talked about that interconnectivity of the goals. So if my company is focused on gender or education, that plays a role in economic growth and decent work. But what it does, it forces a dialogue between companies and the stakeholders in the community to look at how they can bring together their separate efforts, so that there's a more strategic focus, and again, that they're not working in parallel. I would say, and this is applicable in any collaboration, I think, beyond employee volunteering, but as applicable there, there has to be a level of trust. There has to be a level of putting aside paradigms of other companies, have how they operate, and just really going into the project with the end goal of collectively making an impact. Companies will still claim their piece of the impact. It's still theirs. They can still brand it. They can wear their T-shirts with their company names. But by collaborating together, they can show greater scale and greater impact. So collaboration, collective impact is certainly critical. And I think all of our organizations have that equal focus. If it was easy, it would be done. But I'm encouraged by the great examples that we see out there.
Definitely, and you know, I think you mentioned a key word when talking about partnerships and collaboration, and it's trust. And I couldn't agree more with what you were saying at the beginning. I mean, it's definitely in this field of corporate volunteering, we see so much transparency and trust. There's no competition. When companies come together to share their programs, to share their initiatives, there is really a sense of, you know, collaboration. And we're very lucky to witness that amongst, you know, companies from similar industries and companies operating in the same regions. I also find a lot of value in what you were saying about regional efforts, because definitely the context changes everything. So with that, I'm coming to my last two questions. I just want to remind everyone, if you have a question, you can type it in the chat. I'll make sure to share with Sue. But we've mentioned impact, the word impact, so many times, and it's embedded in what you do. But in the context of corporate volunteering, how can companies commit to not only address but also showcase impact? What would you say are a couple of ways that they can use to do this?
I mean, certainly you know, we touched on measurement before, and I think that's going to be that's going to be our ongoing focus as an organization until we have this measurement framework launched. Because to be honest, certainly, you know, in my career with corporate social responsibility, it was exactly the same. You know, we primarily measured hours. But it is so painful when you see corporate responsibility reports come out and you know, they're so data heavy. And yet when it comes to community impact and employee volunteering, it's the photos of the smiling volunteers and the number of hours and the, you know, as you mentioned before, the stories. So, you know, I think for us as a profession, you know, in the corporate volunteering space, it's how do we, because that wouldn't work in other parts of the business. It wouldn't work in other parts of the company. The board of directors, the shareholders wouldn't accept reporting out in such a way. So I think to truly sort of professionalize our practice of corporate volunteering, I think that way of being able to show, you know, how we can claim a portion of that impact of what a nonprofit organization has done, what a school system has done, what a food network has done, by saying, by investing our people, we were able to claim a portion of the impact that they've made. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but I think it's going to be key, and even more so going forward.
It does. Last year in September, we had a meeting of leaders, 100 leaders from 4 different sectors of volunteering in Latin America. So they came from the corporate sector, academic, civil society, and the government. And they came together in Lima. We had a meeting about understanding the future of volunteering in the region. And one of the things that came multiple times in our discussion was that need of understanding how to measure, but not only how to measure, but also how to talk about what we measure. And I believe there's so much impact in telling the right story. And
yes.
And there's gonna be so many things happening around that, particularly in times of crisis, because the other day I was in another webinar and I was hearing someone say, I am tired of the stories of the same stories when it comes to COVID, you know, the same 3 stories. Mm-hmm. We need to start understanding how impact is happening at deeper levels. So I'm really excited to see what happens with the work that you're developing to measure and to showcase that impact. And Sue, we're less than 10 years away from the culmination of the Agenda 2030 as a framework. That doesn't mean that the issues are going to be gone or that we are not going to be able to use the narrative and the framework of the agenda, you know, to continue our conversations and our work. But as a framework with certain goals, we're less than 10 years away from the end of that. What comes next when understanding the Agenda 2030? What comes next for corporate volunteering and the SDGs, and what needs to be prioritized in terms of addressing them? And I'm talking specifically about program managers of corporate volunteering. You know, what would you think should be the priority when they think about SDGs and their programs?
That's a great question. Dr. Murabit, our CEO, participated in an interview with Bill and Melinda Gates about 5 weeks ago, talking about it was actually called The Economics of a Pandemic. And really the thrust of the conversation, the thrust of the message was, as you mentioned before, about this spotlight that has been put on these tremendous inequalities that there are around the world, and which have been exacerbated, which have been made far worse by the pandemic. Bill Gates mentioned that, I think this is a statistic that's well known, but you know, I think it was 15 years ago when the percentage of people in poverty around the world was 20%, in the range of 20%, and that had dropped drastically to 8% at the beginning of this year. That is completely turned around now. The levels of abject poverty as a result of COVID-19 are definitely going in the wrong direction. So if there was ever a time for the private sector to rally around the Sustainable Development Goals, which are intended to address, you know, the many inequalities around the world, it would be now. I think for program managers, if I were to say or suggest some ideas for how they could focus, I think all companies should be looking at the focus areas of their employee volunteering program. I'm sure everybody already is, but if anybody hasn't thought about, do we need to, it doesn't mean we need to change direction, but we certainly need to evaluate our current strategy. Is it relevant now as we move into, hopefully within the next year, into a post-COVID-19 world with all of the fallout from it? So, you know, I'd say that's a priority that has to happen within all levels of the organization. So engaging senior leadership, engaging the community, and most importantly, ensuring that employees have a voice or have a seat at the table. I think, as an aside, one of the things that we have seen come out of the past few months is the level of activism that's happening around the various issue areas, critical issues in our communities. And it's our employees, it's your employees that are part of this movement. Employees are passionate about purpose. So, you know, ensuring that they're part of that, if they're not already, I'm not saying that companies are not engaging their employees in developing their strategy, but if there's anybody out there that isn't, you definitely want to be able to say going forward that your employees have helped craft the corporate volunteering focus. I think also there is an opportunity to ensure that corporate responsibility or corporate volunteering focus areas are linked in with human resources and linked in with employee engagement. We see that's a direction that many companies are already taking, but there are still many companies where it is siloed. And there's a great loss there because employee volunteering is a driver, corporate volunteering is a driver of employee engagement. And also it's an opportunity to, depending on the type of volunteering that they're doing, is it also linking to their own professional development? So having those sort of three focus areas speak to each other within a company is also key, because that also further legitimizes the power and the importance of employee volunteering within a company. So, I think for program managers out there, think about those things as well. Also, it goes without question, if you're not already thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals, making sure that you're able to thread that through. We're at the halfway through the first year of the decade of action. These goals were set to be achieved by 2030. Who knows how far we will get now with certainly the setback of the pandemic. But I would strongly encourage companies to leverage that model. And then for program managers, again, I'm sure what I'm saying is people are already doing this. You're already talking about collaboration and collective action, but just put it on. Make sure you're checking that box, making sure that you have talked with your colleagues at other companies, explored opportunities as communities start to rebuild. Strategic focus is going to be more key, because the worst thing that could happen is that the efforts of your employees, the efforts of all of our employees globally, are not making the most impact. They're contributing their time, their talent, their expertise, their innovation, their passion. They deserve to have a strategy behind it that can enable them to make the most possible impact. So again, I'm sure these are all things that are discussed on the other calls as well, but hopefully I'm just reinforcing or reiterating many of the messages that you've all heard before. But delighted to answer any questions, and wish everybody much success with the very tough months that I think everybody is going to face in the months ahead. But I'm excited about what the potential is as we come out the other side of this.
Yeah, you've not only reinforced a lot of what we've heard, but you've also brought to the table very important insights. So thank you very much for that, Sue. Many of the questions that we're getting are around how-to. So I'm going to pick just a couple, trying to summarize what we are hearing from participants. And Antonio has a two-part question. I think the first one you discussed a little bit, but he would like to know, how can he decide which SDGs should he connect his company's action with in terms of a framework, and how to do it strategically, or if he should just tackle specifically a couple of them, or just talk to them as a whole within the context of what they're doing in their company?
Great. It's a very good question. That's one that I probably hear most often. Companies take different approaches. There are certainly companies that have said or made the decision that all of the goals are important, and we're going to allow our employees to focus in on all of those areas. If they want to be involved in hunger, or they want to be involved in gender, or they want to be involved in climate, we'll support that. And there's certainly value to that. But where we see most companies deciding is which of the goals can we have the most impact on? Which are the goals that are somehow aligned with our strategic priorities? That doesn't mean it has to be aligned with, the company's business. Although, it goes without saying, the pharmaceutical companies traditionally focus their employee volunteering around health-related initiatives. But I think it has to be a decision broadly within the organization, because you want to have your senior leadership aligned with whichever of those goals that it is that make most sense for your company, for your employees. One of the values of focusing in on specific goals, so say if it's education, for example, is it enables you to talk about impact, talk about outcomes, talk about sort of the global story of what your company is doing, rather than it being fragmented with lots of different efforts around different goals. So purely from a position of being able to showcase what your company is doing, if there are specific issue areas, then it helps out. I'm probably not helping here, but there are different approaches. But I would say it has to be strategic. It has to engage senior levels and your employees as you're making a decision which one makes most sense. Because if you select whichever goals or sub-goals, the targets you select, you definitely want them to be in place for the next 10 years. It's not something that you would change each year. You want to be able to show the build over time. And then also, hopefully, connecting with other companies, community organizations to see what role you can play as part of the broader community effort. So I don't know whether that made sense, but there isn't a one size fits all. Each company has taken a slightly different approach, and all work.
Definitely. You talked about senior management, and there's a question from Susanna here about mechanisms to engage senior managers. And she says, seriously engage them beyond taking a photo at the end of the project or the program. Any tips maybe from your experience also working in developing a corporate volunteering program?
Yeah. I think, again, many different approaches. If I go back to my time with the Ritz-Carlton, the approach, I was fortunate because I sat on the executive committee, so it was a rather unique situation, but just sort of that relentless communication about the importance of this. We termed it serve with purpose. So it linked both the customer service focus of the company, but also service to community. But we embedded it in our business goals. And then as an evolution of that, then made leaders accountable for the efforts they were doing. It is not easy. I would say it's something that many companies around the world struggle with. But, depending where you sit within the organization, it's certainly important to have an advocate, a sponsor at the senior level. I think the opportunity to evolve away from just the photo opportunity and the big check, and it would actually engage them. I mean, in fact, one of my proudest moments at the Ritz-Carlton, when we had our general managers meeting, it was the last general managers meeting, I helped orchestrate the community event. But we had 140 general managers fly into San Francisco, and they spent a day at a high school, and we had a full program where they were immersed in career development conversations with the school. The power of that, because they, as all employee volunteers, they came away, they took more away from that program than probably even the school children did. So I think exploring opportunities to ensure that senior management engage in projects and don't have just that opportunity to show up for the photo opportunity, but actually play a role. So that in itself, I know it's not easy, but I would say that's probably going to be the most powerful way. And then also making senior management the spokespeople, because executives want to be successful, they want to be seen as being successful, and they want to know the subject matter they're talking about. So if they're on the spot talking about community impact and corporate volunteering, then hopefully there'll be greater levels of engagement. So different ways. I hope that helps. It's not easy, but I would say engage them in the actual projects beyond just physical digging, planting, making sandwiches, whatever. Just finding substantive opportunities for them to make a difference in the community.
Thank you, Sue, for that. And I'd like to finish the round of questions with with an interesting one that is coming from Brazil, from Silvia, who is one of the leaders of a research group on corporate volunteering that they have nationally. She says that it's very difficult to sometimes have companies in the country engaging with initiatives as Impact 2030 or CLAVE or GCVC, because they are very small teams with very limited budgets. So she says, is there any strategy that you think helps to provide them with the sense of value and importance that these groups have, so that they can escalate that request and become members?
Thank you for that question, Sylvia. I know Sylvia. Sylvia collaborates with Impact 2030. So yes, a great question. What you would, I mean, even if you look at the large multinationals, there are some out there that have very small teams. So although, I mean, certainly, you know, most companies have very small teams, but I'm often amazed how you'll have a big multinational and you will expect they maybe have a team of 30 in corporate social responsibility and employee volunteering. So it really does vary. But I think it's that, you know, that is the value of these collaborations to help companies learn from each other. What saddens me greatly is I will go to different companies and see the same conversations, the same effort being put into planning, the same dialogue, the same lessons learned, the same mistakes being made. And there is, even in large companies, the resources are limited, and they're going to be more limited because we know companies are cutting back budgets. It's going to have an impact on employee volunteering budgets. So I think that opportunity to get into dialogue with companies to see how can we collaborate to make impact, because if I'm just a team of one or two, there's only so much mobilization that I'll be able to achieve with my employees. And how sad is that? So and there's so much need in each of our communities, whether it's Brazil, whether it's in South Africa or Colombia or Spain or North America, wherever it might be. So I would say, you know, don't stay behind the office door trying to reinvent the wheel because somebody else has already had those, just that sharing of knowledge between corporate volunteering professionals is critical. And I mean honest conversation, not just going into meetings and showcasing what works great, but really what isn't working and what can we potentially do together. Because if you've got 5 companies with 2 people in, that's 10 people that can mobilize, activate employees for the community. So it's an age-old problem, Sylvia. I share your pain.
Thank you, Sue. And I think it is also important for us as, managers of these networks and people trying to advance conversations around corporate volunteering to understand that there are constraints and that we should be also trying to offer spaces for those who cannot, maybe they cannot join this year, but if they see the value, if they join our conversations, then they might be able to make a case to join next year. I think, it's a step-by-step effort.
Yes.
And we really want to thank you for being here with us. I think we've been as I was telling you early, it's been very rewarding to see how many organizations and managers and coordinators in Latin America for different sectors are really interested to learn how to connect with corporate volunteer programs and how to offer value to their communities. So thank you so much for your time, for your great insights. And here in Latin America, we're hoping to create deeper partnerships with our colleagues at Impact 2030. And we hope we can advance a global conversation on the importance of corporate volunteering for sustainability.
Well, I wish you all tremendous success. Thank you. I really am honored to have had this opportunity. I know everybody's time is very valuable. So thank you for the opportunity to be part of this interview, and I wish everybody a healthy and safe time forward, and much success with your programs. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sue. And thank you, everyone, for participating. Have a good afternoon. Bye.
Bye-bye.